Hello and welcome to my channel. Before moving on, hit the like button and subscribe and press the bell icon and comment your country. Today we dive deep into a haunting tale from the quiet town of St. Mary's, unfolding in the early months of 2003. This story revolves around a man who, to the world, appeared to be a devoted servant of God. But behind the closed doors of his seemingly sacred life lurked secrets so dark they would lead to a shocking unraveling, a tale of betrayal, forbidden desires, and a chilling act of murder. Father Michael O'Donnell, known for his eloquence, heartfelt sermons, and unwavering dedication to his congregation, was a man revered by many. But beneath the holy image lay a hidden truth, a secret life that would spiral into a web of scandal and devastation. This is the gripping story of a priest drawn into a forbidden love affair, a relationship that would set the stage for a deadly confrontation, shaking the entire community to its core. Michael's sermons, rich with warmth and wisdom, resonated deeply with his parishioners, and his commitment to the church seemed unshakable. But what they didn't see was the inner turmoil that haunted him, a battle between the image he presented to the world and the desires he fought to suppress. From a young age, Michael knew he was different. Growing up in a devout Catholic family, he found comfort in the church, a place that provided refuge from the confusing emotions that plagued his soul. As a teenager, Michael began to realize that his feelings toward other boys set him apart from his peers. These emotions were not fleeting or trivial. They were a profound part of him that he couldn't ignore. Yet, he also understood the harsh reality. These feelings would be condemned by the very institution that had become his sanctuary. Convinced that a life of service to God could help him suppress these desires, Michael made a pivotal decision. At a young age, he entered the seminary, throwing himself into his studies with the hope that his devotion would rid him of what he saw as sinful thoughts. But as the years went by, his prayers for deliverance went unanswered. The loneliness he felt only deepened, and the internal conflict became an unbearable burden, growing heavier with each passing day. Michael's early years as a priest were marked by a relentless battle between his faith and his forbidden desires. He poured himself into his work, hoping that his unwavering dedication to his congregation could fill the void within him. Yet, every time a parishioner confessed struggles with love or lust, a sharp pang of guilt would pierce his heart. He knew all too well the weight of such emotions. Night after night, Michael would retreat to the chapel, spending hours in fervent prayer. He begged for the strength to uphold his vows, for deliverance from the feelings that tormented him. But no matter how hard he prayed, the loneliness never truly left. It lingered like a shadow, a constant reminder of the life he could never fully reconcile with his true self. Despite his efforts to suppress his emotions, the feelings grew stronger with time. The quiet desperation that consumed him set the stage for the moment when temptation would strike, a temptation that would lead him down a path of irrevocable choices and unimaginable consequences. It all began when Michael met Jonathan. It was a warm summer evening when Jonathan first walked into St. Mary's, his eyes brimming with a mix of curiosity and admiration as he marveled at the church's grand architecture. Michael noticed him instantly, captivated by the young man's vibrant energy and undeniable presence. Their initial conversations were innocent, centering around art and philosophy. Jonathan, a passionate artist, was particularly enchanted by the church's intricate stained glass windows and the stories they depicted. He spent countless hours in the church courtyard, sketching the delicate details of the building's design, each piece inspiring him anew. As time passed, their discussions grew more profound. They began to explore deeper topics, moving beyond the physical beauty of the church to ponder faith, love, and the essence of existence itself. Jonathan was unlike anyone Michael had ever encountered. Open-minded, free-spirited, and unafraid to challenge conventional thinking. He stood in stark contrast to the rigid traditions and beliefs that had defined Michael's world, awakening something within the priest that he had long tried to suppress. Michael began lingering longer after Mass, hoping to catch even a fleeting moment with Jonathan. Their conversations became the highlight of his day, a rare and welcome escape from the inner turmoil that seemed to follow him everywhere. For Michael, Jonathan was a beacon of light, someone who brought a sense of ease to his otherwise conflicted life. Jonathan, in turn, was drawn to Michael's intellect and the quiet strength he exuded. There was an unspoken connection between them, something undeniable and magnetic, yet it left Michael equally exhilarated and frightened. One evening, as the setting sun cast long, golden shadows over the church, Jonathan invited Michael to join him for a walk. Together they wandered through the still, quiet streets of the town, their conversation flowing effortlessly. For the first time in years, Michael felt a sense of peace, as though, for that fleeting moment, he could let down his guard and simply be himself. But that comfort came with a dangerous closeness, a closeness Michael knew he should resist. Yet, no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't bring himself to pull away. The turning point came one quiet night in the rectory. Michael and Jonathan had been discussing a piece of art, a portrait of a saint that Jonathan was working on. He had asked for Michael's opinion, and the two stood close, poring over the intricate details of Jonathan's sketches. As they studied the artwork, their hands brushed lightly against each other. The touch was electric, sending a surge through Michael's entire body. It was a moment that caught him completely off guard, a moment where years of repression, isolation, and longing came crashing down all at once. Before he could think, Michael found himself leaning in, his heart pounding in his chest. His lips met Jonathan's in a kiss that was both passionate and desperate, a culmination of everything he had tried so hard to suppress. In that instant, the walls he had built around himself began to crumble, and he stepped into a world he had long denied himself. From that moment forward, their relationship evolved into something far deeper than friendship. They began meeting in secret, stealing fleeting moments of intimacy in the hidden corners of the church. The forbidden nature of their affair only seemed to ignite their passion, making each encounter more intense and exhilarating than the last. Yet, as their bond deepened, so too did Michael's fear. He was consumed by his love for Jonathan, but it came with an overwhelming sense of dread. He feared discovery, what it would mean for his reputation, his position in the church, and the life he had built. Even more unsettling was the growing distance between him and the God he had devoted his life to serving. The fear of divine judgment loomed large, leaving Michael trapped in a relentless cycle of love, guilt, and anxiety. Sister Agnes, a devout and perceptive nun who had served at St. Mary's for decades, began to notice troubling changes in Father Michael. His once passionate sermons had grown lackluster, and his usual calm demeanor had become tense and agitated. Her instincts told her something was amiss, and she resolved to observe him more closely. It wasn't long before her suspicions were confirmed. One evening, driven by her unease, Sister Agnes discreetly followed Father Michael to the church's rectory. Peering through a narrow crack in the door, she witnessed a sight that left her stunned. Michael and Jonathan locked in a passionate embrace. Shock and horror gripped her as the truth unfolded before her eyes. Sister Agnes quietly retreated, her mind racing with disbelief and concern. She knew she could not remain silent. The reputation of the church, its very foundation of morality and sanctity, was at stake. Determined to take action, she resolved to confront Father Michael and report what she had witnessed. The following morning, Sister Agnes confronted Father Michael directly. With a firm yet compassionate tone, she implored him to repent, to confess his sins, and to put an end to the forbidden relationship before it spiraled into an even greater scandal. Her words carried a sense of urgency, driven by her unwavering devotion to the church and its values. Michael, however, found himself paralyzed by conflicting emotions. He was torn between his profound love for Jonathan and his deeply ingrained sense of duty to the church. The weight of the decision was unbearable, and he could not bring himself to take immediate action. Desperate and overwhelmed, he begged Sister Agnes for time, promising her that he would find a way to make things right. Father Michael found himself consumed by desperation. He knew that if his affair with Jonathan were to become public, everything he had worked for, his position, his reputation, his very identity, would crumble in an instant. Yet, the thought of losing Jonathan was equally unbearable, creating an inescapable conflict that gnawed at his soul. As the days passed, the pressure mounted. Sister Agnes grew increasingly impatient, warning Michael that if he did not take immediate steps to rectify the situation, she would be forced to act. Her determination left Michael feeling cornered, with his options dwindling by the moment. In his desperation, Michael began to formulate a plan as dark as it was dangerous. The terrifying thought crept into his mind. If Sister Agnes were no longer around, his secret could remain hidden forever. But as the idea took shape, a chilling question loomed. Could he truly bring himself to commit such a heinous act? Late one night, Michael paced the rectory, his mind racing with guilt and fear. The weight of his thoughts was unbearable, and he turned to alcohol in a desperate attempt to silence the voices of doubt and his own tormented conscience. The dim light of the rectory seemed to close in around him, amplifying his inner turmoil. It was in this moment of despair that Jonathan arrived, immediately noticing Michael's distressed state. Concerned, he pressed Michael to share what was troubling him. Unable to hold back any longer, Michael confessed everything: his love for Jonathan, his overwhelming fears, and the dark plan he had begun to consider. Jonathan was stunned, his face a mix of shock and sorrow. He pleaded with Michael to abandon such a terrible idea, insisting that he could not let the man he loved become a murderer. His heartfelt pleas were filled with desperation, but they fell on deaf ears. Michael, consumed by fear, guilt, and the numbing effects of alcohol, was beyond reasoning. In his mind, there was no other way to protect the life he so desperately clung to. The night of the murder was bitterly cold, the darkness pressing in like an ominous veil. Father Michael had arranged to meet Sister Agnes in the church, presenting the meeting as an opportunity for confession and reconciliation. Trusting in his intentions, she agreed, believing that Michael was finally prepared to repent and make amends. As Sister Agnes knelt in the confessional, Michael quietly approached her from behind. For a moment he hesitated, the gravity of his plan weighing heavily on him. The reality of what he was about to do hit him like a crashing wave, leaving him momentarily paralyzed. But in his trembling hand he held a rope, a chilling representation of the desperate and twisted path he had chosen. Without warning, Michael looped the rope around Sister Agnes's neck and began to tighten it with all the strength his fear and guilt could muster. She struggled fiercely, gasping for breath, her hands clawing at the rope in a desperate attempt to free herself. But Michael, consumed by his overwhelming emotions, was relentless. He held firm until her resistance faded and her lifeless body slumped to the ground. The moment the act was done, Michael stumbled back, horrified by what he had just committed. The enormity of his actions crashed down on him, leaving him in a state of shock and disbelief as he stared at the scene before him. The horror was far from over. In his frantic state, Michael had failed to notice one crucial detail. Jonathan had followed him to the church, desperate to prevent him from carrying out his plan. Jonathan arrived just in time to witness the unthinkable. Michael standing over Sister Agnes's lifeless body, the rope still clutched in his trembling hands. When Michael realized that Jonathan had seen everything, panic consumed him. He tried to explain, to justify what he had done, his words spilling out in a frantic torrent. But Jonathan stood frozen in shock, unable to process the reality before him. The man he loved, the man who had brought so much light into his life, had just committed murder. Desperate to salvage what he could, Michael begged Jonathan for help. He pleaded with him to assist in covering up the crime, insisting that they could still be together, that they could escape and start a new life somewhere far away. Jonathan was torn, his heart aching with love for Michael, but his conscience screaming against the monstrous act he had witnessed. After what felt like an eternity of internal conflict, Jonathan reluctantly agreed. Driven by a mix of fear, loyalty, and the desperate hope that he could somehow save the man he loved, he chose to stand by Michael, even as the weight of the crime loomed over them both. Together, Michael and Jonathan wrapped Sister Agnes's body in a heavy cloth, their hands shaking with the enormity of what they were doing. Silently, they carried her to the church's dimly lit basement. The air was thick with dread as they buried her in the shadows, hoping that their secret would remain hidden forever. But their grim attempt to conceal the truth was short-lived. The very next morning, Sister Agnes's absence at morning prayers sparked concern among the other nuns. A search was launched immediately, but no trace of her could be found. As the hours stretched on, worry turned to suspicion, and it wasn't long before the police were brought in to investigate her mysterious disappearance. Father Michael, gripped by an overwhelming sense of guilt, struggled to maintain a facade of normalcy. He tried to carry on as though nothing had happened, but the weight of his actions was impossible to ignore. The guilt consumed him, gnawing away at his composure. His sermons became erratic, lacking the passion they once held, and his increasingly anxious behavior only served to arouse further suspicion. Jonathan, too, was crumbling under the weight of their dark secret. The burden of what they had done began to seep into every corner of his life. His art, once vibrant and full of passion, became lifeless and hollow. His relationships with others grew strained, and his mental health deteriorated rapidly as the guilt gnawed at him day and night. Meanwhile, the police investigation was intensifying. Determined to uncover the truth, detectives conducted thorough interviews with everyone at the church, including Father Michael. Although Michael tried to maintain his composure, the detectives quickly noticed cracks in his facade. His nervous demeanor, evasive answers, and the inconsistencies in his statements raised red flags, drawing their attention ever closer to him. As the investigation progressed, the pressure on Michael and Jonathan intensified. The weight of their crime bore down on both men, pushing them further into despair. Jonathan, unable to cope with the overwhelming guilt, turned to alcohol as a way to escape. His once vibrant and passionate spirit gave way to deep despair and self-loathing. The guilt eroded not only his sense of self, but also his relationship with Michael, leaving a growing chasm between them. One evening, after a heated argument that left both men emotionally raw, Jonathan stormed out, leaving Michael alone in the rectory. Consumed by desperation and fear, Michael turned to the bottle, hoping to numb the storm raging within him. But the alcohol only fueled his paranoia. Thoughts raced through his mind, convincing him that Jonathan was on the verge of betraying him, that he would go to the police and confess everything. Driven by this spiraling fear, Michael decided he had to act. He convinced himself that it was only a matter of time before the authorities discovered the truth, and he could not allow Jonathan to be the one to bring him down. His desperation turned to resolve, setting the stage for an even darker chapter in their story. The final confrontation unfolded on a stormy night, the howling wind outside echoing the chaos brewing within. Michael, his judgment clouded by alcohol and driven by spiraling paranoia, stormed into Jonathan's apartment. His fear had morphed into anger, and the argument between them escalated rapidly. Michael accused Jonathan of planning to betray him, his voice shaking with both rage and desperation. Jonathan, heartbroken and utterly drained, tried to calm Michael, pleading for reason and understanding. But Michael was past the point of listening. In a fit of uncontrollable rage, he reached for a nearby object, a large ornate sculpture that Jonathan had used in his art, and swung it at Jonathan. The blow landed with a sickening thud, sending Jonathan stumbling backward, dazed and bleeding. As reality sank in, Michael froze, the enormity of his actions crashing down on him. Panic set in as he realized there was no turning back from what he had just done. His fear, anger, and guilt had driven him to a point of no return, setting into motion a chain of events that would spiral further into darkness. With trembling hands, Michael reached for the same rope he had used on Sister Agnes. Overcome with desperation and fear, he wrapped it around Jonathan's neck. Tears streamed down his face as he tightened the rope, his sobs mixing with the sound of Jonathan's struggling breaths. Within moments, Jonathan's body went limp, and the room fell silent, save for Michael's heart-wrenching cries. As he collapsed to the floor next to Jonathan's lifeless body, his sobs grew uncontrollable, the weight of his actions pressing down on him like a crushing wave. Unbeknownst to Michael, the commotion had not gone unnoticed. A concerned neighbor, alarmed by the sounds of shouting and struggle, had called the police. Officers arrived swiftly, their concern mounting as they approached the apartment and heard muffled cries from within. They knocked and called out to Michael, but his response was incoherent, just sobbing that betrayed the severity of the situation. Realizing they could not wait any longer, the officers forced their way inside, preparing for the worst. As the officers escorted Michael out of the apartment, something inside him snapped. Overcome by a wave of panic and desperation, he broke free from their grasp, lunging toward a nearby officer and seizing his firearm. In a frenzy, Michael fired wildly, his actions devoid of logic or aim. The bullets struck one of the officers and an innocent bystander passing by the building, sending shock waves through the scene. Chaos erupted instantly. Officers shouted for backup, their commands echoing through the night as they scrambled to restrain the unhinged priest. The sharp cracks of gunfire reverberated through the apartment complex, plunging nearby residents into fear and confusion. Fully consumed by his unraveling state of mind, Michael retreated back into the apartment, slamming the door behind him and barricading himself inside. His thoughts were a whirlwind of desperation, guilt, and madness, leaving him incapable of coherent reasoning. The storm outside was no match for the tempest raging within his own mind. The police wasted no time in surrounding the building, their weapons drawn as they assessed the volatile situation. From inside the apartment, Michael's frantic shouts echoed through the walls, a chaotic mix of anger, despair, and disjointed ramblings. It was clear to everyone that they were dealing with a man who had completely unraveled. The authorities evacuated the entire building, ensuring the safety of its residents as they prepared for a tense standoff. Negotiators worked tirelessly, pleading with Michael to surrender peacefully. They assured him that no one else needed to get hurt, urging him to come out and end the ordeal without further violence. Michael's responses, however, were erratic and incoherent. He raved about God, his sins, and the unbearable guilt that had consumed him. His words painted a picture of a man crushed under the weight of his actions. He blamed everyone, Jonathan, Sister Agnes, even the congregation, for his downfall, unable to accept the full responsibility for the path he had chosen. Inside the apartment, Michael's mind raced uncontrollably. He knew there was no way out, no way to undo the damage he had caused. The life he once knew was gone, shattered beyond repair. Yet the thought of facing judgment, whether from the police or from God, was unbearable. He felt utterly trapped, confined not only by the physical walls of the apartment, but by the crushing weight of his own guilt and despair. As the standoff dragged on, the tension outside grew palpable. The police, increasingly anxious, feared that Michael might lash out again and endanger more lives. With every passing moment, the situation became more volatile. Realizing they were running out of time, the officers began preparing to storm the apartment, their urgency fueled by the need to end the ordeal before it escalated further. Inside the apartment, Michael was teetering on the edge of his breaking point. The full weight of his actions came crashing down on him, the lives he had taken, the sins he had committed, and the irreversible choices that had brought him to this moment. He stared at the bloodstains on the floor and the fragments of a life he had once shared with Jonathan, now reduced to nothing but memories steeped in regret. Despair consumed him, leaving no room for hope or redemption. As the police prepared to breach the door, Michael came to a grim decision. He reached for the gun once more, his hands trembling as he gripped it. In the stillness of that moment, he whispered a final prayer, pleading for forgiveness from a God he feared he had forsaken. Deep down, however, he knew that forgiveness might forever elude him. With a trembling hand, Michael pointed the gun at the door, bracing himself for the inevitable confrontation. His heart pounded as he waited, knowing that this moment would determine his fate. Suddenly, the door burst open, and the police stormed in, their weapons trained on him, ready to act at a moment's notice. But Michael didn't fire. Instead, he turned the gun on himself, intent on ending his torment once and for all. Just as his finger hovered over the trigger, a gunshot echoed through the room. The police had acted swiftly, and the bullet struck Michael in the shoulder, causing him to cry out in pain and drop the weapon. The force of the impact sent him to the ground, and before he could react, the officers were on him. They wrestled him into submission, their movements quick and precise as they secured him in handcuffs. Michael lay on the floor, his body racked with pain and his mind swirling with defeat as the chaos around him began to subside. The apartment was a chaotic scene. Officers shouted commands, paramedics hurriedly tended to the wounded, and Michael lay on the floor, his body writhing in pain from the gunshot wound. His hands were quickly secured in handcuffs, and he was dragged to his feet, his face a mask of pain and resignation. His glazed eyes betrayed the heavy weight of the moment as he was escorted out of the apartment. As Michael stepped outside, the grim reality of the night's events began to sink in. The officer he had shot lay motionless on the pavement, his body covered by a hastily draped blanket. Nearby, paramedics worked frantically to stabilize the bystander, an innocent person who had been caught in the crossfire. The stretcher carrying the injured man was loaded into an ambulance, his life hanging by a fragile thread. The air was thick with the weight of the tragedy that had unfolded. The crowd that had gathered outside stood in stunned silence, their eyes fixed on the once respected priest as he was escorted toward the police car. The chaos of earlier, shouts, gunfire, and frantic movements had given way to an oppressive stillness. The weight of the tragedy that had unfolded hung heavy in the air, leaving those present frozen in disbelief. Michael offered no resistance as the officers pushed him into the back of the car. He didn't speak, didn't cry. He simply sat there, staring blankly ahead. His expression was hollow, his mind finally numbed by the enormity of his actions. The crushing weight of his guilt bore down on him like a vice, leaving no room for hope or redemption. There was no escape now, only the certainty of judgment awaiting him. The news of Father Michael O'Donnell's arrest spread rapidly through the quiet town of St. Mary's, leaving shockwaves in its wake. The congregation, once united in admiration for their devoted priest, was now deeply divided. Some were overwhelmed with disbelief, others seethed with anger, and many were simply heartbroken. The church, a place that had once symbolized solace, peace, and moral guidance, was now shrouded in scandal. Its sacred walls, once a refuge for the troubled, stood as a stark reminder of the horrors that had unfolded within them. The community, grappling with the weight of betrayal, struggled to reconcile the man they had trusted with the dark truths that had come to light. The trial was swift and decisive, as the evidence against Michael was irrefutable. The recovered bodies of Sister Agnes and Jonathan, the testimonies from law enforcement officers, and the recordings of the harrowing standoff painted a damning picture. Each detail further solidified Michael's guilt in the eyes of the court. The jury returned a verdict without hesitation. Michael was found guilty of multiple charges, including murder, attempted murder, and assaulting law enforcement officers. The sentence was severe but fitting, life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judgment brought a sense of closure to some, though it could never erase the pain left in the wake of Michael's actions. In prison, Michael was a shadow of his former self, a broken man, stripped of the purpose and faith that had once defined him. He no longer prayed, nor did he seek redemption. His days were consumed by silence, his mind haunted by the faces of those whose lives he had taken and the life he had irrevocably shattered. The love that had once filled him with joy and hope had become a tormenting specter, a constant reminder of the nightmare his choices had created. There was no waking from the darkness he now lived in, only the endless weight of guilt and regret that followed him into every moment. The town of St. Mary's began the slow process of healing, though the scars left by the tragic events would never fully fade. For months the church remained closed, its once sacred halls steeped in the shadow of betrayal and loss. When it finally reopened, it was under the leadership of a new priest, one who approached his role with unwavering dedication. The new priest worked tirelessly to rebuild the fractured faith of the congregation. Through acts of compassion, honesty, and devotion, he sought to restore the church as a sanctuary for hope and community, helping the townspeople find solace once more in its walls. As for Michael, he spent the remainder of his life in solitary confinement, a prisoner not just of his physical surroundings, but of his own mind. Day after day, he was haunted by an unrelenting cycle of guilt and regret, the weight of his choices pressing down on him with no relief in sight. The priest who had once been a symbol of hope and guidance had become a somber cautionary tale, a stark reminder that darkness can exist even within those who appear most devout. His story echoed far beyond the walls of his prison, serving as a chilling example of how unchecked desires and desperation can lead to unthinkable consequences. Thanks for watching the video. Subscribe and hit the like button. Comment your favorite part in the video.